The Maori are an indigenous group living in what is known today as New Zealand. The Maori were a Polynesian people originating from the island Hawaii, their ancestral homeland in the South Pacific Ocean. New Zealand was the last substantial landmass to be colonized by prehistoric people. The exact date of the first Polynesian voyage and settlement of New Zealand is not known for certain, but it is believed to occur around 1,000 years ago. The Maori were master voyagers. They traveled thousands of miles across the Pacific Ocean in large canoes called waka haurua. The first 7 fleet of waka haurua that arrived in New Zealand were called Tainui, Te Arawa, Matatua, Kurahaupo, Tokomaru, Aotea, and Takitimu. Upon arrival, the voyagers named the long North Island Aotearoa, which means long white cloud. The Polynesian people were isolated in New Zealand for several centuries and developed their own unique society and culture, which became known as Maori, which means common or normal, and was used by the Maori to distinguish themselves from foreigners. The Maori originally settled in the east and spread throughout New Zealand, forming many hapu or clans. The Maori were expert hunters and fishermen. They cultivated land and introduced vegetables from Polynesia, such as sweet potato. They produced beautiful works of art and used tattooing extensively. For hundreds of years, the Maori people lived in harmony with nature and with one another, and it was not until the arrival of European settlers that these balances were disrupted. The first European explorer to lay sight on New Zealand was Dutch explorer Abel Tasman in 1642. He was on an expedition to discover a southern continent rich in minerals when he came across New Zealand, although he did not land his ship nor colonize the land. It was not until 1769 that the first Europeans landed on the shores of New Zealand when explorer Captain James Cook landed and charted New Zealand by 1779. The British East India Company had extended their charter to include New Zealand. By 1842, there were 125,000 Maori and about 2,000 settlers in New Zealand, most of which were sealers, whalers, merchants, and missionaries. As more and more Europeans emigrated to New Zealand, there was more competition for land, and Maori chiefs sought protection from William IV, the King of England at the time. With British settlement increasing steadily, the British government decided to negotiate an agreement with the Maori chiefs to become a British colony. The Treaty of Waitangi was signed on February 6, 1840 by over 500 Maori chiefs and the British Crown. This treaty gave the British government sovereignty over most of New Zealand. The Maori version of the treaty translates differently from the English version, which led the Maori chiefs believing that their lands were going to be protected, when really this document gave the King of England the right to rule over New Zealand. Confusion and disputes over ownership following the Treaty of Waitangi led to violent conflicts during the 19th century, known as the New Zealand Land Wars, lasting until the 1860s. The wars meant losses for both Maori and the colonists, but the British eventually won the majority of land in New Zealand. While disagreements over the terms of the treaty still continue today, the Treaty of Waitangi is considered to be New Zealand's founding document. Weakened by the introduction of guns and European diseases, the Maori population declined radically after colonization. The Maori population is estimated to have been about 100,000 in 1769 and reduced to around 42,000 by 1896. Ever since the early days of New Zealand's colonization, the British have depicted Maori society as lawless, violent, and disorderly. This myth, however, is not true, as the Maori had their own sophisticated system of social organization and dispute resolution before European settlement, which was grounded in the Maori worldview and social structure. To this day, the myth of Maori as a lawless people persists and has led to the marginalization of this group, particularly their over-representation in the New Zealand criminal justice system. Maori worldview and customary law will be compared and contrasted with the British legal system in order to make the argument that the myth that law and order did not exist in Maori society pre-European contact is false and still contributes to the marginalization of the Maori today. The first argument that debunks the myth that law and social order did not exist in Maori society pre-contact is the complex social organization of Maori. Maori were organized into a social order with the base being the whānau, then the hapu, and finally the larger social group, the iwi. These units are very important in the organization of Maori, and we will discuss how each unit strengthens the argument that law and social order did exist in Maori society pre-contact. There are many levels to the social organization of Maori, with the base being the whānau, which is the family unit. The whānau was, and still is, the basic social group in the Maori socio-political system. The whānau consists of 3 to 4 generations, which is inclusive of grandparents, parents, children, and grandchildren, and can number up to 30 people. The leadership of the whānau was at the hands of the kaumātua, the oldest male member of the whānau, but it was common for the leadership to be influenced by a kuia, his wife. Having an organized leadership level, even at the base of the Maori social order, shows a solid structure and respect for order. The inclusiveness of women's opinions illustrates the respect that pre-contact Maori had for people within the whānau unit despite rank. The next level in the social order of Maori is the hapu, known in English as the sub-tribe. The hapu is the uniting of various whānau units. The land that the whānau unit was situated on was owned by the hapu and housed various whānau units. This land was called the pā. The ownership of land was recognized and respected by other hapu of the main tribe. An interesting aspect of the hapu is that if a child's parents belonged to different hapu, then the child had membership rights to both hapu. This is important because it illustrates how Maori promoted inclusivity and community. The whānau units within the hapu were connected to each other by a common ancestor that could be traced up to 9 generations back. This is demonstrating an active knowledge of genealogy and respective history. This connection to ancestors was, and still is today, a vital part of Maori social order, and it reinforces the collective worldview that Maori possess. It demonstrates a civilized order that existed before contact and has managed to be maintained post-contact. The iwi, known in English as the tribe, is the largest level of Maori social order. The iwi is made up of various hapu which inhabit a specific region and trace their genealogy back to a common ancestor. The region that the iwi established as their territory was fixed in the areas where the waka landed in New Zealand. Hapu sometimes fought within an iwi for various reasons, but they would always unite to defend the iwi against any other iwi. This shows that Maori respected social order by putting aside personal grievances to ensure the well-being of the greater community. This 3-tier social order was very strong pre-contact and managed to last today. For myself, my whānau unit shares the last names of Rowai and Hamilton. My hapu is Ngai Tamatirangi because Tamatirangi is the common ancestor of various whānau units from my area, and my iwi is Ngāti Kahungunu. The Ngāti Kahungunu iwi trace our genealogy back to Kahungunu. The people of Ngāti Kahungunu trace our ancestry back to the Takitimu waka. In Maori social order, the waka does not hold any weight as a solid form of union. Rather, it is just part of Maori mythology and how we came about establishing our regions. The main difference between pre-contact Maori politics and modern Maori politics is that the iwi is now the biggest political unit, as opposed to the hapu. Before contact with British, Maori leadership could be divided into 3 social strata. This contributes to the debunking of the myth that British brought law and order to the Maori people. The first group in Maori social order to discuss is the rangatira, known in English as the gentry. The rangatira were the chiefs of hapu and iwi. These positions were particularly held by men. However, firstborn women of high-ranking families were also highly regarded, and particularly important in forming political alliances between powerful groups, commonly through marriage. The next class is the tutua, who were the commoners. These were all other members of the hapu. The tutua were typically descended from junior lines of ancestors, whereas the rangatira were the senior bloodlines. The last social class were the taurekereka, or the mokai. These were slaves which were taken or born into captivity, often as a result of battle. The big difference between Maori and British slaves was that taureka were not held in custody or under restraint. Rather, they were just required to do most of the menial tasks, such as carrying firewood and preparing food. Another interesting aspect about taureka is that their children were born free and able to marry and start their own family within the hapu. This is a very important point because it shows that within Maori social order there was rationality and forgiveness. It emphasized that Maori social order was based on collaboration and utilizing every member of the society for a productive purpose. British settlers in New Zealand had their own social order, in contrast to the Maori social order, which was based on community needs and protection, within which there were social classes. British social order was centered on individual ownership and success. For British settlers, there were slight divisions in hierarchies and class, but they were not as pronounced as those in Maori social order. The aristocratic class were distinguished through their ownership of land in more rural areas or businesses in urban settings. But because of the small size of firms and towns, some social mobility, and broad property ownership, it is argued that class consciousness was replaced by aspirations for individual mobility instead. This illustrates that there was a lack of community among British settlers in New Zealand, which vastly contradicts that of Maori society. Through this breakdown of Maori social organisation, it proves that there was a pre-existing social order prior to the arrival of the British. It was complex as it had many different levels of intertwining units and social classes. Maori social order was, and still is today, based on genealogy and ancestral grounds. This means that the order is able to exist outside of colonial institutions brought in by the British, as Maori law and social order predates British arrival. Because Maori had a strong social order pre-contact, it proves that the British could not have and did not bring social order to the Maori people. Maori believed that humans possessed a strong tapu or sacredness put there by their spiritual figures. This tapu was made up of 4 key human attributes: tinana, wairua, mauri, and hinengaro. It was these aspects which together formed a complete person, which is a physical, spiritual, emotional, and intellectual being. The Maori believed that a state of balance or well-being would be achieved if these different elements were in harmony. Thus, individual actions which disrupted this harmonious balance required societal resolution. It is important to note that Maori society was largely based on the principle of whanaungatanga, or kinship. The individual was important as a member of a collective, and each person's identity was determined through that individual's relationship with others. Tikanga Māori is a set of beliefs, standards, principles, or norms which the Māori community followed as the way of conducting themselves. It extended to all parts of Māori society, including political, social, moral, spiritual, and economic matters, and also included the underlying values behind particular actions. Tikanga Māori can be interpreted as similar to the rule of law for Māori society pre-contact, and it revolved around the responsibility by the individual to contribute to the well-being and harmony of the collective. When tapu was violated by an individual or group, this was considered a hara, or crime, and left the victim in the state of tikanga imbalance, which then required utu, which means repayment. This idea of utu was central to dispute resolution in Māori society, as it aimed to restore something lost and to balance the action which caused it by an equivalent action. According to Tikanga Māori, justice was a communal affair. Any offence committed against an individual had wider impacts for the entire hapu, or sub-tribe. For example, if a woman was attacked, then this would affect her ability to carry out the role of a mother, caretaker, spouse, etc. Therefore, the pain suffered by one individual was felt amongst the entire hapu. Similarly, the wrongs committed by the perpetrator were not seen as individual wrongs, but rather the community would accept responsibility for the actions of the offender. In this sense, dispute resolution was not from one person to another, but rather whole communities would gather to discuss the dispute, or in some cases, the victim and offender would gather with the rangatira, or chiefs. Another aspect of tikanga Māori is that conflict resolution was a ceremonial justice, meaning legal disputes could be resolved through performances such as song, dance, speech, or chants. Another form of ceremonial dispute resolution was katika tomate, which was a dramatic performance and acted as a substitute for actual violence. Only in extreme and exceptional circumstances did Maori take up arms against one another. The legal system of the British at the time of New Zealand's colonisation differed greatly from Maori customary law and was seen in the eyes of the British as the superior legal structure. English criminal law placed a particular importance on offenders' intention to commit a crime. However, for Maori, intention was not important when determining consequences for someone's actions. Patterson explained that the wrong occurs within somebody's sphere of accountability, within their sphere of mana, and so that individual or community accepts responsibility, even if the wrong was not caused by them. In England, criminal law aimed to regulate social behaviour by matching crimes with their proportionate punishment, rather than aiming towards restorative justice like the Maori did. Whereas the British courts operated independent from societal influences and were dominated by a select few, the Maori system posited that all parties to a dispute should play a role in its resolution. However, the British associated communal ownership with primitive peoples and individual responsibility with civilization. The incompatibility of English and Maori law is due to the vastly different worldviews which underpin them. While British criminal law was focused on individual punishment, Maori law focused on retribution by and for the community. So why would it be in the colonists' interest to create this myth about the Maori as a lawless, ungoverned people, when this is evidently not the case? It was likely that, in order to justify the British imposition of their own legal frameworks, which was completely opposite to the values and customs of the Maori, the colonizers feared recognizing tikanga because recognition of these apparently barbaric customs would undermine British attempts to civilize Maori. George Grey, Governor of New Zealand from 1845 to 1853, once said that enforcing English law inter se weakened the position of tribal elders over younger Aborigines, thus reducing the social barriers to Aborigines adopting European culture, law and religion. It was never within the British government's rights to subject the Maori to their backwards legal system, and was unjust to impose British law on a people whose culture, history and society differed so drastically. In the first few years of colonization, Maori were punished for their crimes against settlers, with little discussion regarding its jurisdiction to punish Maori under the criminal law. Doing so was part of the colonial power's goal of individualizing Maori society in order to break down its tribal basis. The effects of British criminal law contributed to the ultimate colonial project to capture and redefine the very process of Maori thought. The more English law legitimized in New Zealand society, the less prominent became the Maori collective law and philosophy. Through this analysis, we have disproved the myth that prior to British contact, Maori were a disorderly and lawless people. In the contrary, Maori lived within a complex social organization that was based on genealogy and focused on the well-being of the collective. Maori also lived by tikanga Maori, which is akin to a rule of law. It is important to disprove this myth because the depiction of Maori being lawless and disorderly has perpetrated negative consequences for modern-day Maori, specifically in the criminal justice system. As of June 2018, Maori represented 50.7% of the prison population, despite only making up 14.9% of the New Zealand population as of the 2013 census. By disproving the myth that Maori are inherently disorderly and lawless, we can contribute to the decolonization of educational systems and social structures that promote this myth and others like it.